You're listening to Good Shepherd Brentwood's sermon feed. Today's sermon was preached by Mother Natalie Van Kirk and recorded on the 20th Sunday after Pentecost, October 15th, 2023.
I speak to you in the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. This morning, we come finally to the end of our sermon series on the patriarchs of Genesis. It has, for me at least, been great fun to carefully read and preach these stories since we started them way back in June. Chapters 12 through 52 of Genesis are really the novel of a family. And the roots of those stories in the novels are 4,000 years old. But what has been remarkable about studying them is how consistent they are and how many bits and pieces of them show up in other parts of not only the Old Testament, but in the New, and how believable the actions and the dialogue are. After all this time, these still feel like real people, and we can see ourselves, our foibles, and our goodness in them. These are also stories of God beginning to gather his people into the people of Israel. You know, Genesis starts with the creation of human beings, and human beings were created to be God's bridge between the created order and the divine. We were created to be his stewards and to bring God into the world. But the first humans showed a terrible, terrible propensity to want to be their own gods. And so at the end of chapter 11, God turns his eyes on the family of Terah in Ur of Mesopotamia. And he selects Terah's adolescent son, who's 75 years old, to be the father of the people that God would make into his own. He will bless them to be a blessing and carriers of his word to all the nations. This family that God chooses, well, they have their own propensity to want to be their own gods, and they're only intermittently faithful. Usually they're only faithful after God has come to them in some sort of dream or night vision and reminded the patriarch of the moment of the promises he, God, has made to them. The whole family tends to say things like Jacob said when God spoke to him for the first time and promised that he and his descendants would be like dust in all of the land. And Jacob says, okay, that's all good. But if God remains with me in this journey that I'm undertaking, and if he provides me with clothing and with food, and if I return safely to my father's house, then I'll worship him. We all try and cut deals like that with God. It's part of what the story of Jacob is about. And this family, they have a tendency to lie, to cheat, to steal, to fight with one another and the neighbors. They'll do whatever it takes to get what they think will help further their own future. And in spite of it all, God remains faithful to them. After a nighttime wrestling match in the desert, God renames Abraham's grandson, Jacob. He calls him Israel. It means he who contends with God. And the story of God's work through Jacob's descendants, the people of Israel, the people who contend with God, will occupy the remainder of the Old and New Testaments. Now, lately, we've been telling the story of Joseph, Israel's 11th son. When Joseph's story opens, he's a spoiled, self-impressed 17-year-old, and his brothers cannot stand him. To add insult to injury, Jacob goes out and he buys Joseph a fancy tunic. It's rather in proportion like giving a Ferrari to one of your children and 15-year-old Hondas to all of the rest. People who wore tunics like the one that Joseph had weren't expected to do the hard work of the shepherd's life. And worse, Joseph has two dreams that he just feels compelled to share with his father and his brothers. And in his dreams, Joseph's brothers and even his parents bow down before him as though he is their Lord. And his brothers have had it to hear. So they decide to rid themselves of this little jerk. And while they're out in the desert, they strip him down and throw him in a pit. And they take his fancy robe and they shred it all up and they dip it in the blood of a kid. And they take it back to their father and say, "Oh my, he's been killed by wild beasts." And in the meantime, right under their noses, a tribe of distant cousins pulls Joseph out of the pit and sells him to another tribe of distant cousins that's in a caravan headed to Egypt, where he will be sold a slave. In Egypt, Joseph will become a very successful slave. Now, during his time as a slave, Joseph apparently grows up. He becomes a man of integrity that his masters can trust, and he learns to work. He learns to work hard. And he becomes aware that the God of his forefathers has blessed him with certain gifts, and he begins to understand those gifts and to worship the God that has given them. When he is 30, Joseph comes to Pharaoh's attention as an interpreter of dreams. Pharaoh has had two dreams, and none of Pharaoh's advisors can either interpret, nor do they really want to interpret, the dreams for Pharaoh. Nobody wants to give Pharaoh the bad news, but it is this: there would be 7 years of plenty, and then 7 years of terrible famine. And after Joseph tells him this, Pharaoh asks him, "What would you do?" And Joseph said, "Well, I would begin gathering grain right away. And I would store it away so that it's available to distribute when the time of famine comes." And because no one else had a plan, and because no one else could interpret his dream, Pharaoh makes Joseph his chief advisor, essentially vizier over all of Egypt. And in Canaan, when the time comes, there is also famine. And so Israel, has sent 10 of his sons to buy grain in Egypt, and he keeps home only Benjamin, Joseph's younger brother, who was in his late teens. Joseph recognizes his brothers, but he's all dressed up like an Egyptian. They have no idea who he is. And he gives them the grain that they request and secretly has his steward return the money that they paid for the grain to their bags. But he tells them if they come again, they better bring their younger brother, or they will not get to talk to him. Now, on their first night out of town, when they make camp, they discover all this money is in the top of their bags, and they're frightened. They're afraid that the Egyptians are going to come after them. What is this that God has done to us? Maybe it was judgment for what they had done to Joseph, they thought. The story has mentioned God very infrequently, but for the brothers who have a really guilty conscience, God is all about judgment. And when they get home, and given how afraid they are, I bet they really hurried home to Canaan. They tell their father all that had happened to them. And he characteristically laments, "Why do these things always happen to me?" Now, when today's reading opens, Israel's people have eaten all the grain that the brothers brought back from Egypt, and he wants the brothers to go back and buy more. But the sons are reluctant. They're very reluctant. First of all, there's this little matter of the money that they found in their sacks, and they're afraid the Egyptians will think they're thieves. And then the bigger matter is that they can't go back without Benjamin. The man that they met in Egypt said that they would not see his face or get any more grain if Benjamin did not come. And Jacob does not want to turn his youngest over to them to journey to Egypt, lest he never come home. Finally, Judah, son number 2, convinces his father. He will take responsibility for Benjamin and the lifelong guilt that goes with it if something happens to the boy. Besides, Dad, he says, in the time we've been standing here arguing about it, we could have been to Egypt twice over and back. Do you want us all to starve? So they take the money that they had taken before and more for the current purchase. And they also take a gift for Joseph: honey and balm and gum and landanum and pistachio nuts and almonds. Those types of gifts are important. They're the gifts of nomadic shepherds, not farmers and not people who manufactured trade goods. These were the things you could gather from the trees and the fields of the land in which they lived. Even in Egypt, at the time of this story, there were tales of Canaan being a good land where figs and grapes were plentiful and honey and olives abundant, and where there was every kind of fruit tree that you could imagine and cattle galore. So they took the best that the land had to offer, and they took Benjamin. Now, from that point, there's a big gap in your reading. It's actually about a chapter and a half, and I didn't think you wanted to sit here and listen to another whole chapter and a half of Genesis this morning, so I cut it a little short. But when Joseph sees that they have arrived in Egypt, he tells his steward, go slaughter an animal because these men are going to have lunch with me. And when they found themselves in Joseph's house, or were ordered to go there, his brothers were terrified. It must be because of the money that they found in their bags. They're going to seize us, and they're going to make us slaves, and they're even going to take our donkeys. Okay, the donkey part is funny. Given his position, the last thing in the world that Joseph probably needed was another donkey. But to shepherds from Canaan, donkeys are real wealth, and it would be a great loss for them to be taken. So at the entrance to the house, you can just kind of see them all over each other trying to get in. They're scared to death, and they're falling all over one another, and they try to explain to the steward, please, Mr. Steward, sir, please, look, we really did pay for our grain the last time. We brought that money back because it was in our bags, and we wouldn't want you to think that we're cheats. We don't have any idea how that money got in our bags. And given the family history of cheating and deception, that last little bit is kind of funny too. All is well with you, says the steward. Don't be afraid. Your God, the God of your father, must have put that treasure in the bags for you because I got my money. All is good. And then he gives them water to wash their feet, and he treats them like real guests, and they have no idea what's coming next. So they lay out their gifts for Joseph, and they wait for him to come home for lunch. And when Joseph comes in, all of his brothers bowed low to him. All the way to the ground, they bowed to him just like the sheaves of wheat in his dream had bowed to him many years ago. Now, being a good host, Joseph asks after their father, is he in good health? And they reply that he is, and they bow again. In fact, they made obeisance, which means that they bowed on their knees with their heads all the way down on the floor. Joseph's dream turned out to be true, and they could not have bowed any lower. And is this your little brother Benjamin? Yes, Lord. And Joseph chokes out and can barely speak. God be gracious to you. And he runs out of the room. And he goes, and they can't hear him, but he weeps in another room to see his brothers and to see Benjamin. And then he washes his face, and he returns to lunch. Now, the Egyptians who were there for lunch were watching all of this with some amazement, and they were about to be even more amazed. Joseph seats his brothers on one side of the room from eldest to youngest. Okay, that's pretty weird because Egyptians don't eat with shepherds. And the servers came in, and they served Joseph. Now, because Joseph was such a high rank, he got his own dishes. He was second only to Pharaoh in all of Egypt. And then the Egyptians were served their own lunch. And because Egyptians in this day and age knew that they were so ethnically and religiously superior to all other peoples, they did not share their meals with unclean nomadic shepherds who smelled bad and were uncouth. Shepherds were abhorrent in Egypt. They were not part of polite company, and no Egyptian would be caught speaking to one, much less eating with one. And then comes an even bigger shock. Joseph sends his own servants down and serves his brothers off of his dishes. And they serve them, and the youngest gets 5 times all the other brothers got. You know, if it had been done in the proper order, the eldest, Reuben, would have gotten the most, and then it would have gone down from there. And Joseph, no one like Joseph would have shared his meal with a bunch of shepherds. Don't you know that Pharaoh's court and all his functionaries had quite a lot to talk about that afternoon? And after lunch, Joseph tells his steward to fill their bags with grain and put all the money back in the top of them. And in the youngest bag, he is to put the silver goblet that Joseph uses for divination. And the steward does what he's instructed to do. And the next morning, when the brothers leave for Canaan, Joseph waits a little bit, and then he calls his steward and he says, "Go after them. Ask them why they returned evil for good and they stole my silver goblet. Why did they do such a wicked thing?" When the steward catches up with him, the brothers are in an absolute panic. How could you say such a thing? We've done no such thing. We even brought the money from the last time back to give it to you. If you find that goblet, the one of us who has that goblet in his bag should be killed. And the rest of us should be slaves. And the steward says, "Well, fair enough. But I think it'll be the case that only the one of you who has the goblet will become a slave." And when they open their sacks, there's the goblet in Benjamin's bag. They cannot go back without Benjamin. It would kill their father. And so they all go back to the city. And when they see Joseph, they throw themselves on the ground in front of him. "What have you done?" he asks. And Judah, the brother who had actually suggested that they sell Joseph rather than kill him all those years ago, he answers, "What can we say, my Lord? What can we plead? How can we prove our innocence? God has uncovered the crime of your servants. Here we are, make us slaves." And Joseph says, only the one who has the goblet will be my slave." So Judah replies with a really long speech. He tells the story of the family and how Benjamin's older brother is dead, torn to pieces by wild beasts. Don't you know Joseph enjoyed that part of the story? and how his father dotes on Benjamin and will die if Benjamin does not return home. Please, Judah begs, take me as your slave instead. And Joseph can stand it no longer. Everyone else out. And all the servants leave. I bet they listened at the doors. And he looks at his brothers and he says, I'm Joseph. And they're terrified. They cannot speak. What are they going to do, or what is he going to do with them? Judah had just said, God has uncovered the crime of your servants. That was for sure. Judah had just told Joseph that he was dead and how he had died, and how was that going to go down? Joseph was powerful. He was more powerful than they could even imagine. And Joseph and Joseph was standing in front of them, sobbing so loudly that they could hear it all through the palace. Thank you. Miraculously, Joseph actually seems happy to see them. Do not reproach yourselves because you sold me into slavery in Egypt. It was to save you and to save life that God sent me ahead of you. Now the story comes to a happy conclusion. Pharaoh hears about Joseph's family and he invites them all to come and settle in the grasslands of Goshen, far away from the Egyptians, like good shepherds should be. And the brothers go back to Canaan and they tell Jacob that Joseph is alive and the vizier of Egypt, Dad, Joseph is the man. Now, how they explained to Jacob that they had let him believe for more than 20 years that Joseph had been torn apart by wild beasts. Yeah, I don't know, the story doesn't say, but I bet it was some discussion. But in the end, they all pack up and they pack up all the children and the wives and all the clan and all the animals and all the tents, and they move to Egypt. So when we get to the end of the stories of the patriarchs, or nearly the end, we know 4 things. How the people of Israel came to be living in Egypt, which makes sense of the opening of Exodus. And there came a time when the Pharaoh of Egypt did not know Joseph. Joseph also becomes for us a model for the vain, frivolous character who with maturity and honesty and integrity and hard work becomes the one entrusted not only with the survival of Egypt at a time of terrible famine, but the story of the survival of the people of Israel. We know third that a key part of Joseph's success is his faith and relying on the gifts and the insights he receives by relying on God. A lesson that was hard to learn. We learn fourth that God can take great evil, even evil like selling your brother into slavery in Egypt and telling your father that he was killed by wild beasts. God can take that and turn it to fulfill God's purposes. And I think there's a fifth thing. God did not work magic with Joseph. He didn't zap him and make him grow up. But it was the change in Joseph, in his heart and his mind and his character, that made Joseph fit for the purposes of God. Had those changes not happened, had he remained the vain, immature, and narcissistic child that he was, Joseph's story would have certainly been tragic, but it would not have ever been redemptive. You know, it is never too late in our lives for us to change, to become fit for the purposes of God. It is never too late to say from this day forward, I want to be different. And there is grace to help us do that. The change will not only bring redemption to our lives, it will bring redemption to the lives of those around us. And we must never, ever think that we have grown too old for that opportunity. Amen.
Thanks for listening. If you're interested in hearing our sermons in real time, you can check us out at our website, www.goodshepherdbrentwood.org, or attend online during our 10:15 Sunday live stream on YouTube. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at Good Shepherd Brentwood. If you have any questions or comments, or maybe you'd like to meet with one of our clergy, you can email us at office@goodshepherdbrentwood.org. Or if you're interested in visiting in person or have questions about our programs and services, you can text 615-637-3738, where you'll be contacted by our staff. We'd love to meet you.